Condemned Criminal Origins rarely makes the conversation when people talk about the best survival horror games. That list is usually dominated by series like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. I've never been especially well versed in the genre, so it was hard for me to understand why Condemned wasn't ranked a bit higher. I remember playing it back in the day on my Xbox 360 and being completely immersed. It was like a detective noir crossed with, bum fights. The violence felt so real at the time. I didn't even understand that it was supposed to be a horror game until the shopping mall level with the mannequins. A section that still haunts me to this day. Revisiting it now, 20 years later, I can see why it doesn't get the same praise as its peers. It's clunky and rough around the edges, especially in its movement and blocking mechanics. It's easy to dismiss a game when the core mechanics feel awkward, but Condemned deserves more credit than it gets. It broke new ground for the genre by fully embracing the first-person perspective. While there were certainly other first-person survival horror games, none of them had quite the same amount of immersion as Condemned, and the world that Monolith Productions built around it remains one of the most haunting. By mixing supernatural elements with a grim detective thriller, Condemned created an experience that was both grounded and deeply unsettling. I want to give a shout out to my channel members. For only $1 a month, you can support my content and get your name in my videos. Condemned was developed by Monolith Productions, arguably one of the most innovative studios of the last 2 decades. The company's origins date back to 1996, when it acquired Q Studios and took over development of Blood, a gory, over-the-top shooter that would later become a cult classic. After several turbulent years in the late 90s, Monolith found its footing again with the success of No One Lives Forever, carrying that momentum into the early 2000s and into what would become a very busy 2005. Around this time, Monolith Productions was juggling 3 wildly different projects, all set to release that same year. The most surprising was The Matrix Online, an ambitious attempt to bring the cyberpunk world of the films into a persistent online MMO. A second project, Fear, was an action-driven shooter that fused military gunplay with the chaos of John Woo films and the unsettling imagery of Japanese horror. Meanwhile, Condemned Criminal Origins took the opposite route, a slow, grounded survival horror experience focused on psychological tension and brutal melee combat. All 3 games were built on Monolith's in-house Lithtech Jupiter EX engine, but each took the technology in a completely different direction. Beyond its distinct tone, Condemned also represented new territory for the studio. It was the first game Monolith developed specifically for a console. While Tron 2.0 and No One Lives Forever had received ports, Condemned was designed to launch on the Xbox 360 as an exclusive. A PC port would follow a year later. But before arriving at the grim and grounded vision we know today, Condemned went through some different iterations. Hidden within Condemned's files was a small reward for players who unlocked every achievement, a behind-the-scenes video featuring a 15-minute playthrough of an early prototype called The Dark. This version cast players as Agent Cross, a disgraced FBI agent with telekinetic powers. In the footage, Cross can be seen stunning enemies, pulling weapons from across the room, and tearing down doors, showcasing a supernatural twist that would eventually be abandoned in favor of something far more human. A second prototype video shows the evolution more clearly, revealing gameplay and mechanics much closer to what would become Condemned Criminal Origins. The game's direction was largely guided by Frank Rook, who served as lead designer and writer on Condemned. Rook had previously worked as a level designer on No One Lives Forever. In one interview, he explained that given Monolith's history, it was natural for them to gravitate towards first-person games, but the team wanted to break away from the rhythm of a traditional shooter. During the marketing for Condemned, the studio did its best to tell players what set their game apart from others of its kind, the main one being that there were barely any other games of its kind. Monolith harnessed the power of the Xbox 360 to create eerie visuals that played with light in ways that weren't too common in 2005, with shadows acting out gruesome murders just out of sight, and the ambient lighting of the levels affecting the tools that Ethan uses. Monolith CEO Samantha Ryan said during a press release that
Monolith's goal with Condemned is to combine a disturbing atmosphere with realistic physics, devious AI, and a sophisticated combat system.
Sega's VP of Marketing, Scott A. Steinberg, followed up with even more detail.
The atmospheric tension and cinematic qualities of Condemned offer consumers the rich experience of a psychological thriller, something that hasn't been accomplished on previous hardware platforms.
So it was clear that Monolith Productions and Sega were positioning Condemned Criminal Origins to be the next big survival horror experience. So let's dig into the gameplay and see how they did. In Condemned, you play as Ethan Thomas, an investigator with the FBI's Serial Crimes Unit. Ethan has a remarkable intuition for solving cases, something the game represents as a near-psychic link to the killers he's hunting. Structurally, the game is built around two core pillars: investigation and combat. Between those segments, the player explores mostly linear environments. Some levels include minor backtracking, often with new scripted events to keep things fresh, but for the most part, Condemned is a straightforward, almost painfully linear experience. Despite that, exploration still feels rewarding. The environments are ugly in a very intentional way. Each level feels both lived in and abandoned, with clutter that tells its own story. While crafting the game's tone and visuals, the team drew heavily from films like Silence of the Lambs and Seven, and it's noticeable. Scattered throughout are collectibles in the form of dead birds and metal pieces, which unlock reports and lore entries in the main menu. Health packs are also hidden around each level, sometimes lying out in the open, other times sealed behind glass you'll need to shatter before you can heal. The movement in Condemned is another thing that sets it apart from other shooters of the era. Ethan moves with a heavy pace, and his limited stamina bar only lets him sprint in short bursts. Moving downstairs or over a pile of debris slows him down even further, which keeps the game's rhythm intentionally sluggish. During the investigation sequences, Ethan stays in contact with Rosa, his lab partner who guides him through the forensic tools he uses to analyze evidence and build profiles of the killer he's tracking. These tools fall into two categories: detection and collection. The detection tools help Ethan locate hidden traces of evidence in the environment. The UV light reveals organic material like blood, fingerprints, and footprints that are invisible under normal lighting. The laser light exposes trace elements and chemical residues, making them glow a vivid green, while the gas spectrometer detects methane from decomposing bodies. Once evidence is found, Ethan switches to the collection tools, which allow him to analyze and transmit data back to Rosa. The sampler breaks down chemical residues and fluids for analysis. The 3D scanner captures the shape of small objects or impressions, like a fingerprint or a wound, and the digital camera documents the scene in photographs. Each tool guides Ethan through the process with visual indicators and prompts, making the game feel like a detective story with training wheels. When evidence is transmitted, Rosa immediately responds with her findings, often accompanied by visuals on screen. She guides Ethan through the evidence, and there is typically a lengthy exposition that ties it into the case, giving Ethan and the player a better understanding of what the stakes are. When Ethan gets a phone call from Rosa, I notice that the character is bound to a certain area, and you cannot leave that area until the phone call is over. I understand why they did that, but it's still funny watching Ethan run in place. In sharp contrast to the slow, methodical pace of the investigation segments, Condemned's combat is tense, a system built around environmental awareness and timing. Every encounter feels like a one-on-one brawl fought with whatever you can get your hands on. They're designed to make you feel like you're at a disadvantage. The enemies do their best to get the drop on you, hiding in walls, circling around to flank you, or waiting until you're distracted to strike. The AI feels similar to Fear, but instead of elite soldiers, you're fighting desperate strangers in abandoned buildings. It makes you cautious, constantly second-guessing what's behind every corner. You do not want to be taken by surprise, because the enemies hit hard, and letting even one hit land can set you up for failure. Learning how to block is essential, but you can't just hold down the button and wait for the enemy to tire out. Every block has to be timed, almost like a parry. It forces you to study attack patterns, anticipate swings, and know exactly when to drop your guard and land a few hits of your own. Enemies will often fight each other as well, with the larger enemies especially posing a threat. There is a surprisingly large variety of weapons in Condemned, and each weapon comes with its own stats: damage, speed, block, and reach, that determine how useful it'll be in a fight. The real stars of the combat are the improvised melee weapons you scavenge from the environment. You can rip pipes from walls, swing a locker door like a shield, or even use the blade from a paper cutter, but you can only carry one weapon at a time. Mixed in with the debris are the entry tools, weapons that serve a purpose greater than beating in a crackhead's skull. Each level features blocked paths or locked rooms that require the right tool to get through. Fire axes for doors, sledgehammers for padlocks, crowbars for safes, and shovels for cutting through cables. It's an interesting mechanic, but it doesn't always make sense. Some tools overlap so much that they start to feel redundant. You can't tell me that a crowbar wouldn't pop off a padlock, or that a shovel's a better wire cutter than an axe. It adds variety, but also a touch of absurdity that breaks the immersion a bit. Since this is a Monolith game, of course, there are guns. The selection in Condemned is fairly standard for a grounded first-person shooter. You've got your FBI-issued Colt 1911, a Smith & Wesson Model 29 revolver, a Winchester Model 1897, a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun, a modified M3A1 grease gun, and finally a Ruger AC-556 carbine, the best firearm in the game, which naturally doesn't show up until the last few levels. I kept wondering why Monolith went with the grease gun specifically for the SMG. It hasn't been produced since the 1950s, and it's not exactly the kind of weapon you'd expect to find lying around a modern American city. But the choice makes sense once you think about it. The M3 was a cheap alternative to the Thompson submachine gun that the US military started producing in 1944. A crude, stamped metal weapon designed to be disposable. If it jammed or it broke, soldiers were expected to just toss it and grab another. That design philosophy fits Condemned perfectly. This is a game where everything feels temporary. In my opinion, guns make the game far too easy, which is probably why ammo is so limited. Instead of collecting spare rounds or reloading, every gun comes with a fixed number of bullets before it's either thrown away or used as a melee weapon. Even the reload button doesn't actually reload, it just tells you how many shots you have left. Condemned also forgoes a crosshair, adding slightly more difficulty when it comes to lining up shots with your limited ammo. Unfortunately, it doesn't add too much more of a challenge. Once your ammo is used up, you can use the guns as melee weapons, but they break after a few swings. A strange design choice, considering the buttstock of a shotgun or the frame of a 1911 should be way stronger than a random 2x4 you rip off of a wall. There is a dedicated button to switch back and forth between the shooting and melee modes. I mostly used that when I needed to break the medkit cabinets open. Enemies have access to all the same weapons you do, which makes every encounter unpredictable. You might turn a corner and face someone swinging a sledgehammer, or worse, a junkie with a revolver. It keeps the tension high because you never really know what you're walking into. Thankfully, Ethan has something that they don't. Another gadget at Ethan's disposal is the Taser, a rechargeable stun gun that freezes enemies in place for a few seconds, giving you time to get a few swings in or disarm them by ripping the weapon right out of their hands. There's nothing funnier than tasing someone, stealing whatever piece of garbage they were holding, and smacking them over the head with it. Joking aside though, the Taser is wildly overpowered, and midway through the game it even gets an upgrade that can knock enemies over, or instantly kill weaker ones outright. After using the Taser, there is a few second period where it needs to recharge, but otherwise it can be used infinitely. After knocking an enemy down, you get the opportunity to perform finishing moves. There are 4 executions that can be performed to kill an enemy. Ethan can either ram them, snap their neck, slam them, or punch them. This is another system I feel can use a bit of work. The executions themselves are fine, but more often than not, I just smack them again with whatever weapon I was holding. It would have been cool to see Monolith implement executions using the melee weapons like in Manhunt. At least the executions stay in first person and don't switch you to a cinematic camera, so I guess it could always be worse. The plot of Condemned can seem a bit convoluted at first. The serial killer storyline is fairly straightforward, but there's also a mysterious cult subplot that doesn't get fleshed out until the sequel. Instead of jumping ahead, I'll stick with what the first game gives us, and try to piece together an explanation from that. Much of the key information actually comes from the between-level reports, with additional details unlocked through collectibles. The story begins when FBI agent Ethan Thomas is called to the Weisham office building, where the latest victim of a serial murderer known as the Matchmaker has been found. True to his name, the killer stages each corpse in a twisted date scene with a mannequin. Ethan is greeted outside by Detective Dickinson, who immediately tries to get in a cheap jump scare. Come on guys, this early? Before collecting any evidence, Ethan gets a call from Rosa, his assigned lab technician. After some briefing and initial scanning, Dickinson notices cigarette smoke and assumes the killer might still be nearby. He and Officer Becker head up the fire escape to investigate, while Ethan is left to search the building. Almost immediately, Becker calls in a panic. Dickinson grabs the phone and warns Ethan that a violent, drugged-up suspect is headed his way. This encounter serves as the player's introduction to combat, and it's over almost as soon as it starts, with Ethan dropping the attacker in one shot. Rosa later calls to confirm that several amped-up addicts have been causing chaos throughout the city. Ethan continues exploring the building, beating down vagrants, until he experiences a strange vision of the Matchmaker. The killer cuts the power, forcing Ethan to restore it manually. When he does, a surge knocks him to the ground, and his pistol is stolen by an unknown man who calmly walks away. Now, armed with a pipe he rips from the wall, Ethan continues his pursuit, smashing through more deranged squatters along the way. He eventually confronts the mysterious man, who holds him at gunpoint and rants about being on a path of righteousness. The situation escalates when the two officers from earlier burst in, only to be gunned down. The killer then tosses Ethan out a window. It's almost comedic because in any other situation, those cops would have lit him up the second he raised that weapon. I guess they hesitated since Ethan was in the line of fire, but those were some impressively bad survival instincts. Between these chapters, we get the first of many police reports. Report number 230, detailing discovery of thousands of dead birds scattered throughout the city, some areas blanketed with carcasses, others untouched. It's unsettling and hints at something supernatural, but the game leaves it hanging for now. Ethan wakes up in his apartment, disoriented. He experiences a nightmare in which he's attacked by a grotesque creature in his bathroom, only to jolt awake and find a man named Malcolm Van Horn in his home. Van Horn introduces himself as a friend of Ethan's late father, and informs him that he's being framed for the murder of the two officers, killed with his own service weapon. As the police close in, Malcolm urges Ethan to escape through the metro station, promising to meet him later. Ethan makes his way down the fire escape and through a locked fence to the metro station. Along the way, he has visions of a shadowy figure silhouetted in a window taking photos. A few moments later, he finds those photos discarded in a trash can, shots of himself in his own apartment. That means whoever took them was positioned across the street watching him. Ethan forwards the images to Rosa, who surprisingly is still in contact with him despite the active murder investigation. Nearby, he finds a bottle of photo developer fluid, suggesting the pictures were processed somewhere within the station. While searching station offices, Ethan receives several calls from Malcolm Van Horn, who hints at some kind of special ability within Ethan. Van Horn tells him that his success in the Bureau doesn't come from skill or luck, but from an instinctual advantage. A gift, as he puts it, but not from God. Following a trail of developer fluid, Ethan reaches an elevator, only to discover that the power's out. So in typical survival horror fashion, he heads down to the basement to flip the switch before riding up to the top floor. Condemned has a habit of holding your hand a bit too much, and this level is one of the best, or worst, examples of that. You come across a blocked doorway. Hard to spot, admittedly, but instead of letting the player figure it out, Ethan has a vision showing somebody pushing the cabinet in front of the door. If that weren't enough, Rosa then calls and instructs you to photograph scratch marks on the floor, which prompts her to tell you to move the cabinet. I get it, sometimes players miss environmental cues, but a vision and a phone call, it's too much hand-holding. After clearing the doorway, Ethan discovers the dark room where the photos were developed, along with more disturbing pictures. It would have been a neat touch if you could still see the police combing through Ethan's apartment from there, but that's just a small nitpick. Ethan finds fingerprints on a tape recorder, but they don't match any known records in the database. Then, in a troubling reveal, Ethan discovers 18 newspaper clippings from serial killer cases he's worked on, confirming that whoever's stalking him knows far more than they should. Several of the clippings are marked with a black X, but the markings are still up to interpretation for now. Leaving the dark room, Ethan has another vision, someone being strangled by a faceless figure. Moments later, he spots the same shadowy man and gives chase into the metro tunnels, where the chapter abruptly ends. The next police report, number 117, mentions that the areas with the highest concentration of dead birds are also the areas with the most violent crime, suggesting some kind of link between the two phenomena. The following chapter is almost pure combat. Ethan tracks the killer through cramped corridors and down onto the train tracks. Some text pops up and tells us the suspect is escaping by train and to not let him get away. Ethan leaps on the back of the train, clinging for dear life while fighting off attackers in the dark. It's one of the game's few set-piece moments. It's chaotic, but it doesn't last too long. The killer smashes out the rear window with a fire extinguisher, sending Ethan flying off the train and back onto the rails. Internal report number 452 adds another disturbing layer. The birds aren't dying from disease, but from sudden, massive brain hemorrhaging. One scientist claims their brains are literally dissolving. It's a weirdly unsettling detail, and it hints that something much bigger than a serial killer is at play. The next chapter opens up deep in the tunnels, with a note on screen reminding us that the killer's train must have stopped at the next platform. Ethan makes his way there, collects a DNA sample from the fire extinguisher, and finds a maintenance room containing a train schedule and an orange jumpsuit matching what the killer was wearing. Rosa analyzes the evidence and spots two routes on the map. One leads to a farm on the outskirts of town, and the other to Burnside. A little later, investigating a train car reveals mannequin limbs from Bart's department store, tying the killer back to his earlier crime scenes and giving Ethan his next lead. Internal report number 802 suggests there's a deeper connection between the dead birds and the city's violent crime. According to the report, the birds are being drawn towards areas emitting strange sonic disturbances, signals that kill them almost instantly when they get close enough. It's unclear whether humans are affected, but the connection between these disturbances and the rising chaos in the city is undeniable. While riding the train towards Bart's department store, Ethan gets a call from his FBI supervisor, Farrell, pleading with him to turn himself in. Farrell's approach feels like something straight out of a police interrogation. He seems calm and empathetic. He offers Ethan excuses, even lifelines to grab onto, hoping to coax a confession. It's very manipulative, and Ethan knows that, so he doesn't budge. The call abruptly ends when the same shadowy figure from before appears behind Ethan for just a moment. Inside the department store, Ethan receives another call from Malcolm Van Horn, urging him to continue the investigation. His tone is different this time. He seems less guiding and more desperate. It's the first real hint that Malcolm's motives might not be as selfless as they appear. I want to pause here to appreciate the department store level because it's easily one of my favorites in the game. Shopping malls and large department stores make for incredible horror settings. There's something fascinating about the contrast between what they were designed for and what they've become. These are places meant to make people feel safe enough to stay for hours, to browse, to linger. Turning that into a nightmare is a tough trick to pull off, but Condemned nails it. Few things are more unnerving than walking through a space that is built to be full of life, now completely silent. Well, silent except for the hobos running around with blunt objects trying to cave Ethan's head in. The store is full of hazards. Vagrants getting blasted with buckshot, psychopaths smashing through windows, and of course, the mannequins. It's pretty fucking terrifying to just be minding your own business and all of a sudden a plastic man is hitting you with a 2x4. I got so paranoid that I just started swinging at every mannequin I saw before they even had a chance to move. Most of them were plastic, but I got a couple of them that way. While investigating, Ethan finds a new set of fingerprints. Rosa confirms they don't match the ones from the metro station, implying there's more than one killer on the loose. A blood splatter on the wall nearby suggests whoever left the prints also got struck in the head. I know this is supposed to be scary, but halfway through the phone call, this lady just comes prancing out of the hallway and kicks a door in. No comment from Ethan, no acknowledgement at all. This is just normal to him now. I go to track her down and she doesn't even attack me right away. It seems like she's leading me somewhere, but that doesn't last too long. She comes back at me with a mannequin arm and I have no choice but to zap her. Following a long trail of drag marks and blood smears, Ethan finally finds the matchmaker's body propped up with mannequins in a dressing room, which raises the question,
if you're here, who's that?
A little later, Rosa calls back with a new theory: someone is hunting the serial killers themselves. Remember those newspaper clippings we found back at the metro station? 7 out of the 9 were marked with black X's. The only 2 that weren't were the matchmaker and the torturer. Now that the matchmaker's dead, that just leaves one name on the list. Before they can talk it through, the police arrive, forcing Ethan to flee once again. Internal report number 991 finally connects the dots. Humans are being affected the same way the birds are. It explains the surge in brain disorders, hallucinations, and the sudden bursts of violence spreading throughout the city. The only question left is, what is causing it? After narrowly escaping the police, Ethan reconnects with Rosa to finish the phone call they rudely cut short. She refers to the mysterious new suspect as Serial Killer X. Together they decide the best way to find him is to predict his next target, the torturer. Unfortunately, Rosa can't access the Bureau's database remotely, so they need to break into the library to dig up information the old-fashioned way. The next chapter is relatively short, mostly combat encounters as Ethan tries to reach safety. It ends with a particularly funny stealth moment where he hides behind a very wide open door while a police officer just walks right past him. At this point, it's hard not to question how this city hasn't been completely overrun by murderers. The cops are outmatched, outgunned, and apparently they're blind. Internal report number 403 might explain why the city's falling apart. It states that petty crime among law officers is up 64%, and domestic violence rates have skyrocketed by 114%. Ethan meets Rosa at the public library, where suddenly she can access the Bureau's database again. Convenient, she hands over Ethan's personal file, which casually reveals that he's basically a superhero. Dense bones, off-the-chart reflexes, and something in his chest so classified they had to censor it. Rosa also gives him an upgraded taser, as if the old one wasn't already broken enough, and then they just leave the file on the table. Hello? Take that with you. The library itself is a pretty uneventful mission, but does introduce the game's most infamous weapon, the paper cutter blade. I cannot count how many times I've heard people talk about this game while saying, hey, remember the paper cutter blade from high school? Didn't you ever want to just hit somebody with it? And yeah, it's as fun as it sounds. I grabbed it every chance I got. Ethan and Rosa eventually find a terminal, but of course, the network is down. While Ethan's distracted typing away, somehow, Rosa gets kidnapped right in front of him. I guess the excuse is that he blacked out or hallucinated, but it's a bold move to lose your only ally mid-Google search. Then Serial Killer X calls, confirming he's taken Rosa. You could still collect evidence, but sending it to the lab just triggers Rosa's voicemail. A clever little detail. This chapter also ramps up the combat. You start running into masked enemies who hit harder and usually attack in groups. They're not much smarter, but they're definitely meaner. Eventually, Ethan locates the server room and spots movement in the rare book section. On the way there, he finally gets his hands on the SMG. It's full auto, sure, but in a game where ammo is precious, it feels like a waste. Ethan finds Rosa alive, but shaken. Serial Killer X forced her to dig up information on the torturer. She discovers a missing high school teacher who once reported a student obsessed with torture fantasies, matching the killer's MO. That student's name is Carl Anderson. After another drawn-out gauntlet fighting various enemies, Ethan and Rosa regroup in the library basement, where the school records are kept. They identify the school and prepare to head there, unaware that Serial Killer X was eavesdropping, getting a head start. I'm not entirely sure why they would go to the school of all places since it had been abandoned and the teacher in question was retired. The only explanation that makes sense is that they worked on the environments first and then tied them to the story. The school being featured in the dark prototype video, looking almost identical, backs up that claim. Internal report number 283 gives us an update on Ethan's situation. Local PD has issued an APB, though they're keeping his name out of the press. The report says the department is taking the matter very seriously and is prepared to use force if necessary. Before Ethan enters the school, he's stopped by Malcolm Van Horn, who casually asks how the investigation is going. He claims it's pure coincidence that he saw Ethan from across the street and decided to say hello. Sure, Malcolm, totally believable. And honestly, I'm starting to question Ethan's detective skills for not pressing harder. Once inside the school, things immediately take a turn for the paranormal. Shit is flying everywhere. Ethan finds a bit of facial tissue smeared across the chalkboard belonging to the missing teacher, Samuel Tibbets. The school itself is surprisingly expansive, full of winding corridors and looping classrooms that make it easy to get lost. Like the department store level, there's something inherently creepy about turning a familiar everyday space into a nightmare. In the cafeteria, Ethan encounters a furious lunch lady armed with a meat cleaver. After the fight, he could pick up the cleaver, but its only real use is to chop off a corpse's arm so he can grab the fire axe it's holding. It's a really absurd moment, and I don't know why they decided to do that. I mean, I've seen this man beat people to death with a 2x4, and you're telling me he can't take an axe out of somebody's hand? I don't know, it's just weird. Ethan eventually makes his way to the gymnasium where he finds Tibbet's arm hanging from a basketball hoop. Like the last thing that this man did in his life was slam dunk. Following a trail of blood, he stumbles upon a grotesque vision of his own corpse, accompanied by the same demonic figure that's been haunting him since the start of the game. The hallucination fades and Ethan gets ambushed in the schoolyard. This is where he finally picks up the Ruger carbine, easily the most powerful firearm in the game. It makes short work of his attackers before he heads back inside, where another vision leads him to a locker. Using his forensic tools, he tracks down Tibbet's body, only for the man to grab him, still barely alive. In his dying breath, Tibbets reveals that while Carl Anderson, the torturer, was mutilating him, another man showed up and took Carl away. The school level ends with two of the game's most overtly supernatural sequences. First, Ethan's attacked by shadowy creatures in a drained swimming pool, a really tense encounter. Then, as he moves through the hallway, he's suddenly lifted into the air by an unseen force and thrown around like a rag doll. When he comes to, Ethan gets a phone call directing him to the second location marked on the train map, an abandoned apple orchard outside of Briar. Malcolm conveniently shows up again, waiting outside to offer him a ride. On the way to the orchard, Malcolm insists he's just trying to help, though his cryptic hints make it clear he knows far more than he's saying. At least Ethan's finally starting to catch on. Malcolm drops him off at the main house while he checks out the barn. Interestingly, there's no internal report this time. The first part of the level has Ethan following messages scrawled across the walls, assembling fragments of a phrase hidden throughout the house. The words are only visible under UV light, which adds a nice investigative touch. Along the way, he's attacked by the usual suspects, and one of those monstrous humanoid creatures from his visions. This one wields 2 pieces of rebar and is much tougher than standard enemies, forcing you to block and counter carefully. I ran into a small bug here that I assume was caused by a trigger not firing properly. The attic door wouldn't open after I defeated the mini-boss, so I had to backtrack all the way down the staircase. When I returned, it had magically fixed itself. Not game-breaking, just a little annoying. Upstairs, Ethan discovers that he's too late again. Carl Anderson, the torturer, has killed himself with a fire poker. While Ethan's debriefing Rosa, their call is suddenly interrupted by Farrell, who orders Ethan to turn himself in and informs him that he's officially cut off from Bureau resources. Ethan then hears Serial Killer X approaching. In a desperate move, he covers himself in Carl's blood and kneels in the middle of the room, pretending to be the corpse. When X gets close, Ethan lashes out with the fire poker, triggering a chase through the house. It ends abruptly when Malcolm appears out of nowhere and knocks Ethan out with a shovel. As Ethan fades in and out of consciousness, Malcolm reveals that serial killer X is his own nephew, Leland Van Horn. I really hope that's a Twin Peaks reference. Internal Report number 779 reveals that federal agencies have stepped in to deal with Metro's escalating crime problem. The agencies aren't named, which raises speculation that whatever's happening here may be on a national scale. When Ethan regains consciousness, he's chained to a wall as Leland Van Horn delivers his villain monologue. He explains how he's been following Ethan's career, killing serial killers before Ethan can catch them, and using each of their own methods to do it. It's all part of his dramatic flair. As he rambles, one of the shadowy creatures lurks in the rafters above. Leland then slices off one of Ethan's fingers, mimicking the matchmaker, before Malcolm tackles him to the ground. Malcolm insists that Ethan killed the creature, claiming it's the true source of the madness. The final level takes place in the abandoned orchard. Ethan fights through some of the toughest enemies in the game, culminating in a showdown with the monster. It's a brutal fight that forces you to block non-stop attacks, while tearing the metal shards from its body in between rounds. After several cycles, Ethan knocks the creature through the floor as flames erupt around him. A brief but undeniably badass moment. In the aftermath, Ethan shares a car ride with Malcolm. The tone shifts as Malcolm delivers a reflective speech about hate, that Ethan has looked into the face of evil, and that controlling hatred is the hardest thing a person can do. His speech is cut short when Ethan hears banging from the trunk. Malcolm tries to deflect, claiming Leland did bad things only because he was influenced by evil. Ethan forces him to pull over, and the player is given a choice: kill or spare Leland. If you choose to spare him, Leland pulls out a pistol and shoots himself. It's an underwhelming ending that completely undercuts the game's message about compassion. It feels like the writers wanted that classic no happy endings horror trope, but didn't quite know how to earn it, so they just settled for shock value instead. When the scene fades back in, Ethan's sitting in a diner. Rosa joins him to discuss what happened. She mentions rumors of a cult behind the killings and starts prying for information. When Ethan asks if he could trust her, Rosa quietly writes a note revealing she's wearing a wire. Ethan denies any involvement with the cult and insists he has no idea what's happening. The final cutscene holds on Ethan's reflection. Then he turns towards the camera, his face replaced by the monsters, and the screen cuts to black. It's an effective jump scare, but more importantly, it implies that Ethan's connection to the madness runs deeper than anyone thought. It leaves more questions than answers. A few years later, Condemned got a sequel, Condemned 2 Bloodshot, which dives into the lore that the first game only hints at. It explains the cult, names the monstrous enemies, and even fills in some of the blanks about Ethan himself. But since none of that context exists here, I'm not going to talk about it. What is in the first game, however, is a series of hidden reports that shed a bit more light on the cult's presence. Picking up the game's collectibles unlocks additional intel from the FBI's investigation, offering cryptic but fascinating background details. The reports mention an ancient language scrawled in graffiti at multiple crime scenes. Once partially decoded, it revealed fragmented messages about ritual sacrifice and the ability to exert control through sound. Several agents involved in the research lost their minds, murdering others before taking their own lives. The project was quickly classified under the highest level of secrecy. And that's where Condemned Criminal Origins leaves us, on a note of unanswered questions and maddening possibilities. I guess we'll just have to wait for Condemned 2 to tell us what the hell is going on. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with Condemned Criminal Origins. The slower, more deliberate pacing and brutal up-close melee combat makes it stand out from almost every other first-person shooter of its time. The investigation sections, while a neat idea, feel more like pacing breaks than genuine detective work. It would have been great to see those tools used more freely, letting players investigate at their own pace rather than at scripted moments. The story is strange and fragmented, but that's part of what makes Condemned so fascinating to me. There's so much to uncover, and the game feels like it's only scratching the surface. The writing at times felt a little weak, especially when the game needs to find a reason for Ethan to go to these very specific locations. I mentioned earlier, but I would not be surprised if the levels were designed first and the story was written to connect them together. Nevertheless, I think Monolith did a fantastic job at utilizing the Xbox 360's power to create a one-of-a-kind horror experience. It's something that has stuck with me for decades, and I'm really looking forward to playing the sequel here eventually. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to join my Discord and chat about your favorite games, or give me something to cover. I'm always hanging out in there and would love to hear from you. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching.